I've chosen to speak on 4 areas where the race of a Black man in America and the treatment as a result of it needs improvement. So we'll do so in addressing the critical elements of the development of a person and his or her interaction with society as a Black individual in America. And while, of course, there are many different areas that can be discussed, I've chosen 4 areas in which racism in America chokes the life of a Black man. First, we'll address is a psychological aspect and its harms. Second, the financial aspect. Third, the educational aspect. And lastly, the legal aspect. And while it's obvious that there are areas that we'll mention that will overlap with one another, and that these areas are just symptoms of a root cause of the fallibility of mankind generally, as it pertains to treating other mankind. It's only a surface level analysis of what is really the deeper problems that, as we go through this talk, will be extrapolated. But as we look at the situation further, will at least give us a framework by which we can answer some more specific grievances that African Americans have raised in this country. And hopefully through the Q&A at the end of this, we'll be able to provide some immediate solutions and principles that can be built on. So we'll address the psychological, the financial, the educational, and the legal aspect. First, what is racism? And what does it actually do to a person's psychology? In recent headlines, the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, is quoted in saying that she has minor depression as a result of the racial inequalities and inequality in the United States. And although her comments can be lost, should be lost, in the context of other comments that she's made about her overall displeasure in this country generally, she does, however, bring up an important reality that is often faced but never really addressed by African Americans. Namely, what does consistent and generational oppression do to the psyche of an individual? In so many words, what do the groans and the laments that are uttered deep within the recesses of an individual's heart, that almost wail, or the anguish that are then translated into the Negro spirituals or sung in the songs, the enormous personal stress that is likely experienced throughout the generations of African Americans dealing with slavery. The personal stress that was likely experienced by a John Lewis, who knew that it would be physical pain that would be his sentence if he literally continued to put one foot in front of the other. Or has been iterated so many times, the turmoil of a Black father who does still have to worry about his sons coming home if they interact negatively with a police officer who has the ability to use the excessive force. What is the psychological turmoil that accompanies racism? Think of the maladjustment that is unwittingly perpetrated by a parent who does not have time to truly rear their child because they had to work extra hard that day to redeem a cotton product on a plantation that they would never own, on a plantation that their kids would most likely be born and be buried on. How do you properly train up a child in that environment? Think of the conversations around the dining room table where the natural conflicts in families occur, but how a person under that level of stress would react to the daily worries of a family under that condition and environment. Think of how those children would then learn to deal with the following generation and the following generation carrying forward. Think of the heavy burden borne by a father's back who is broken physically by the work he has to do, but also broken by the understanding that he could work 10 times harder than any man has ever worked in the world, but will never be able to provide for his family because he is enslaved to someone else. Think of the psychological harms that accompany institutional racism. Think of yourself in stressful situations, how your heart races in stressful situations, and the strain that puts on your heart physically. And so imagine the permanent stress of having to live in a nation where your skin color can be a death sentence or a life-draining burden. Think of the strain of that heart and how that leads to physical illness. How do you properly develop or properly be trained on the basic developments of speech and communication or articulating and dealing with your feelings? Isn't it then obvious why children who have experienced this racism generationally have difficulty paying attention to tasks, difficulty focusing when their mind is elsewhere? So the Black psychology does come out in its music. It's said lightly, but African Americans, Black Americans created the blues, an entire genre of music that spoke to these woes that generations have felt. But racism had such a strong hold on our psychology that alongside the blues, we also created the Negro spirituals that talk about the stony road that we trod. Even our Black national anthem speaks of the stony road we trod, the bitter chastening rod felt in the days where hope unborn had died. The lyrics of our Black national anthem, they talk about hope, that hope which is an expectation or a desire for a certain thing to happen. But it says hope unborn had died. How do you abort hope? Aspirations of achievement are aborted. Ambitions or goal setting for yourself and for your children is aborted. Aiming, reaching for, wanting more, trying to attain more is aborted. Planning is aborted. Expectations are aborted. Anticipations are aborted. How do you overcome when your hope unborn is killed? That's the wailing, the groaning, the anguish that comes about with institutionalized racism when it's not dealt with properly of an individual and it's buried deep down inside. The anguish that that individual goes through, yes, is sometimes expressed through yelling and anguish, but also it can be expressed through a silent tear. I think of Denzel Washington's award-winning movie, Glory, where as a soldier, he's now fighting for his freedom. He's being reprimanded and disciplined by a whip. And as he's being whipped, he shows his back, which has already been scarred with whips. And while maintaining a stoic face, while he holds back the wailing, holds back the yelling and the anguish, one single tear emerges out of his eyes. Sometimes that single tear demonstrates the worst of pain. So in everything that I've described now, it only takes a second to realize that racism and institutionalized racism can crush you psychologically. But what also can racism do to a person financially? The second aspect of racism in the Black man is how do you address this financially and the effects, the systemic effects that it has financially? One of the best examples that we have of the financial inequities is in the business loan situation, where business loans were summarily denied to African Americans. And those same business loans would be granted to those white persons who would apply in the same exact economic position. And the test was run. African American owned businesses would apply for those same loans, but they do so via shell companies run by white individuals. And although it was Black people in the background, because the loan request was presented by a white person, it was then granted. Access to capital has always been a critical element for a successful financial enterprise and building generational wealth. It's what lifts up an individual financially. Access to capital is the fuel by which your ideas can be materialized. But historically, and as in the example that I just gave, banks have had these unfair practices where they've signaled out African American companies, placing undue creditworthiness assessments, which disproportionately impact African American business owners. And in many cases, more obvious denials to access of capitals that are now proved to be on racial grounds because the same was afforded to a white person in the exact same situation, but denied to an African American. And I mean the same exact specific loan situation from a bank to start an enterprise would be given to a white person, but would be denied to an African American. The same can be shown loans that are given to individuals for businesses, but also loans for housing situations. Housing loans is a great way for an individual to access the middle class through home ownership. Also, promotions within the job. If this individual is able to have this work in a merit-based society, they're now working. But compensation has been shown to be denied to African Americans, where compensation would naturally increase because of an individual's responsibility and their experience. Many industries, not only are African Americans historically excluded from those industries, but when they do participate in those industries, they are not able to advance in an equitable fashion to their counterparts of the same education and the same experience. So those extreme inequities, they exist. They exist in the financial sector. They exist in the job market, where the very work of your hands is undervalued simply because of the color of the hands working. The very work of your hands is undervalued simply because of the color of the hands working. So what can racism do to a person in education and achievement? We've already addressed its psychological effects and its financial effects. What can racism do to education and achievement? Well, the earnesty to teach themselves, the earnesty for African Americans to learn from themselves, is just what these great institutions like the Tuskegee University and other historically Black colleges and universities were all about. They were founded because of the disparities that existed, where Blacks who were fully competent and willing to learn were not able to access educational opportunities. So we got to the point where African Americans decidedly needed to teach themselves. And so these institutions were established. And that's not to say anything about those ongoing discrepancies where resources that are allocated by the government for education are allocated amongst white communities to the betterment of white populations in a way that is inequitable to what Black populations are receiving even today, where the average number or the average dollar that a state spends on a child can dramatically increase because of the zip code that that child is living in. And that zip code, that area of town that that child lives in, is determined being predominantly either white or Black. So psychologically, financially, and even in the education system, there are systemic racism that occurs and generational racism that ought to be dealt with. Lastly, what can racism do to a person legally? And of course, this is one area that most of our current attention is being focused on, that what the criminal justice system can do to a person legally, not lawfully, but legally. From the inception of an individual's interaction with the system, through the laws that are in place, through the inability of a person stuck in the criminal justice system to have any hope of rehabilitation, the system has often been said to be played to keep a Black man down. The first interaction with the system, where a Black man is stopped either on foot or in a car by a police officer, and that police officer has discretion. Discretion which is otherwise naturally divided between separate powers or separate branches of government. As a constitutional attorney, I credit the founders of America separating the powers of the executive, the judiciary, and those that are writing the laws, the legislature, between three powers, so that the branches are equal, but no single branch can have all that power in one. But the interaction that a Black man has with a police officer on the street is the first time that these branches of government are amalgamated into one individual, the police officer, where the discretion that that police officer has is amalgamated into one individual, where they can make the judicial pronouncement of guilt by saying there's probable cause, but then immediately execute that judicial pronouncement by depriving a person of their liberty, either by arrest or depriving that person of their life itself via use of deadly force. Because these powers, as they were originally founded, are best carried out by separate entities, when it is amalgamated into one individual, errors occur. And that error is sometimes fatal. And so the reactions are also fatal and final. You know, as mentioned, there are several areas to which race in America and the systemic racism that has gone from slavery through the Jim Crow era that is even present today is very real. And there are a number of solutions. I believe that what is done best, what can be done best as solutions is home education. Education is done best at the home. I believe in the financial sector, capital is used best when it is produced and kept and shared within the community. To address the psychological harms, I believe the building up of an individual and their psychology rests on something far greater than themselves, such as a reliance on their spirituality, a reliance on the legacy that they have and that they can hold on to. Lastly, I believe that there should be better accountability for those entities that have too much amalgamated power and don't have proper ways of relating to the communities to which they're dealing with. And through their amalgamated power, being able to abuse the rights of individuals, even in the legal process. Of course, this is only a surface level analysis. There are deeper problems that can be extrapolated and dealt with. But this should at least give you a framework by which to answer or even ask some of the more specific grievances that the African Americans and Black Americans have in the United States. And also hope to provide some immediate solutions based on principles that can be built on. So the psychological, the financial, and the educational, and the legal aspect is one way to frame your thinking about, yes, the problems that exist, but also begin working towards a solution. I'll quickly pivot and tackle for maybe the next 10 minutes, just talking about the so-called standard bearers for Black rights of the past 5 years. And it's important to know that the Black Lives Matter movement is a very recent development. The Black Lives Matter organization tend to put themselves as the new standard bearer for the Black American, but it's a very recent movement. Although the African American history and its advocacy for equal rights spans over 400 years in the United States, with giants like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. and Harriet Tubman and John Lewis, the more recent so-called standard bearers that dictate the narrative for African Americans have done so in a manner that is very inconsistent with the past. The Black Lives Matter organization does this, and they do this intentionally. And while they may harbor well intentions, they have unfortunately adopted the negative spirit of the times. The mantra that if you are not with us, you are against us. And worse than that, while they are claiming Black civil rights, they have rejected the traditional values in America, the rights that have been built on the shoulders of the previous generation. The rights, as mentioned earlier today, have been built on Judeo-Christian principles and have sought to replace that with a new ideology that seeks to break down those very soldiers that they claim to be standing on and dismiss the strategies of the past. They dismiss the work of the past, and they seek to reinstitute a very different outcome for what they claim is the new Black order, or their new definition for the African American success. The goals of the Black Lives Matter organization goes far beyond what people think. And they're hiding in plain sight. They're there for the world to see. If only we read beyond their slogans or their innocuous sounding media accounts of what the movement is, this group has underpinnings of a radical Marxist agenda that seeks to do away with the building block of society. They seek to do away with the foundational structure of society, which is the family. They seek to do away with the family and replace the family with the state. They seek to destroy the economic stability that comes from the family, the psychological stability that comes from the family, the best form of education that begins in the family. They seek to do away these things, these very things that have begun the work of ultimate emancipation, the work that traveled through the Jim Crow era, fighting through civil rights, and the ultimate traditions that will raise the Black people for today. The Black Lives Matter does away with these foundational principles. They are anti-family. They say that we disrupt the Western prescribed nature of the nuclear family structure. They say that we want to disrupt that. They want to care collectively for one another in extended families. They try to destroy the Western prescribed nuclear family. The Western prescribed nuclear family is based on the Judeo-Christian principles of what the family is. It's the Genesis 2, the Matthew 19 standard, that a male father and a female mother come together in holy matrimony. And the product of their love, being children, do best when they have a father and a mother raising them. That's the central tenet of all of civilization. The law itself and society's order itself is built out of the concept of the male meeting the woman. The first time that law is introduced is something that many of us have experienced, where an individual who's always autonomous decides to give up their individual autonomy when they join with another person. And so the laws of courtship, the first time that you say, I'm no longer an individual, but I want to join my life to you, the laws that begin in courtship and that extend to marriage and ultimately to the family are the basic building blocks of even the principles of law. That family structure that is built out of that holy matrimony is the basic building block of law. How that individual family then reacts to their neighbor and reacts to their society, and the laws that govern their interactions are the basic building blocks of society. But that is exactly what the Black Lives Matter organization seeks to target and seeks to pull down. Secondly, the Black Lives Matter organization is an anti-life and pro-abortion organization. Strong allies of their cause, the Planned Parenthood Foundation, the world's largest abortion provider, targets more Black lives than it does any other life in this country. More Black lives die at the hands of Planned Parenthood, an associate of the Black Lives Matter Association, than any other race. While African Americans are in the minority in this country, only 13% of the country is made up by African Americans, 7 or 8% made up of female African Americans. Over 38% of all babies killed in the womb are African American. It's a targeted genocide. It's consistent with the eugenics movement that the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, had, her ultimate goal of exterminating the Negro population. That's the sort of bedfellows that goes along with the Black Lives Matter organization and goes along with their mantra. On the other hand, they have no regard for Black pro-lifers, for individuals and advocates who are championing the cause of life for Black babies. They have no regard for them. To say that this is hypocritical or to say that this is a double standard does not even give credibility to how atrocious it is and how intellectually dishonest it is for the double standard given to Black pro-lifers and Black babies by the so-called pro-Black Lives Matter organization. Here's a story exemplifying this. I provide legal counsel to an organization of pro-life advocates who were in front of the Planned Parenthood in Washington, D.C. And as you may know, in our nation's capital, the mayor of Washington, D.C. has permanently painted the streets of Washington, D.C. in giant Black Lives Matter wording, where you have to cross the street over the words Black Lives Matter. You have to drive over these words Black Lives Matter. Even from an aerial perspective, you can see from an aircraft flying overhead these words Black Lives Matter. It's clearly on public streets. But there was a group of pro-lifers, and I represent them, give them legal counsel. They were standing in front of a Planned Parenthood. And they were doing so on a Saturday morning 2 weeks ago, calling out the atrocity that goes against the Black Lives Matter, calling out that this is an abortuary, the very factory of death for Black lives, that Black lives are killed and slaughtered in this building right in front of us. And they had sidewalk chalk, which is erasable. It'll be erased by the next rain. And they wanted to write preborn Black Lives Matter. And as soon as they began writing the words pre, they were immediately arrested, thrown into jail because they wrote preborn or began to write the words pre in front of a Black Lives Matter sign. If they had started writing Black Lives Matter, it would have been fine. But because they wanted to call out the atrocity of what was happening in the womb, and they wrote preborn Black Lives Matter, they were thrown into jail. It's a double standard within the Black Lives Matter organization and movement that demonstrates that they are not truly for all Black lives, but only those Black lives that are politically expedient to their ideology. And what is that ultimate ideology? Well, it's an ideology that is anti-Christian. The thoughtful, crafted ideology or agenda that they have, the values and mission of the Black Lives Matter movement is unmistakably incompatible with biblical Christianity. The many reasons that Christians should reject this movement can be found easily on the Black Lives Matter website. According to their own description, Black Lives Matter was formed by 3 Black women, 2 of whom were born male, transgender women who proclaim themselves as being queer, which is fundamentally an incompatible lifestyle to the moral standards of Christianity. And while their leaders do care about injustice and racism, they also care about normalizing sexual deviance, deconstructing the biblical definition of family, and emasculating strong Black men who identify as straight. And it's in their words. They say we're committed to doing the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uphold Black trans folks. Another principle on their website says that we are committed to fostering queer affirming network, that when we gather to do so, we gather with the intention of freeing ourselves from the grip of heteronormative thinking, rather than the belief that in the world that all are heterosexual. That is what the Black Lives Matter movement champions and stands for. They are anti-Christian. Fundamentally, they are a Marxist and communist organization. They do drive to eliminate police brutality, but they have a far more extensive leftist ideology that would upend American economic and social life based on a Karl Marx principle. They want capitalism abolished. The principal platform proposed by Black Lives Matter does nothing to hide their true Marxist views. It calls for a collective ownership of resources, of banks, of businesses. It's a highly progressive income tax, a guaranteed minimum income, and the ideas of government jobs that are only fit to benefit the state. This is straight from the pages of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. So the Black Lives Matter movement is Marxist, it's pro-abortion, it's anti-Christian, it's anti-family, and it's pro-LGBT. And while the difficulties that I mentioned at the beginning in the African-American communities are true, they're systemic, they're indisputable, the solutions are varied and complex, and you can debate them. But one line that we should automatically draw is any idea or any agenda that seeks to upend the very basic laws and foundation of a well-ordered society, which is the family. I have no trouble saying that Black Lives Matter, but I also have no trouble saying that the Black Lives Matter organization does not represent what is true and necessary for the achievement and the advancement of African Americans. In full conclusion, I believe the ultimate solution for all of our woes, for all of the issues mentioned previously, can be found in the last stanza of the Black National Anthem. It says, God of our weary years, God of our silent tears. Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. That is the true solution of equality, of true justice, of justice-oriented outcomes for the African American that begins and ends at the throne of God. It's a God-centered, family-based approach that calls for human responsibility, that calls for self-government, that calls for political engagement, but which seeks to uplift the rights of all persons. It seeks to provide equal protection for all persons. And one indication of whether or not it comes from God, if it recognizes that all persons are created in his image, both those who are born and especially those who are unborn.